From the 1st to the 5th century, Britain was an outpost of the Roman Empire. Beginning around 450, when the Roman legions were withdrawn to protect Rome from invasion, Britain was invaded by Germanic peoples known to history as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Where did these invaders come from? The invaders already had a presence in Britain, but when the Romans left, the system of government and the economy they had created crumbled, and people from the Jutland Peninsula and south saw an opportunity. By this time, of course, Rome had been officially Christian for over a century, and paganism had been supplanted under the reign of Constantine, both in Rome and also in the hinterlands, like Britain, which had its own native pagan religions until Christianity and the Romans came. While historians for years referred to this period as the Dark Ages, modern historians say this is less a description of the time period in general than a bias toward England and Europe's classical roots. This advances the notion that the West was just a superior civilization to those barbaric cultures in Asia, and ignores the sophistication of those cultures. Arabs, for example, made many advances in science and mathematics long before Western cultures. Little is known about Anglo-Saxon paganism because, unlike Christianity, it was not text-based. Certainly one advantage of Christianity came from the ability to write its history and its doctrines down. However, through missionaries, the Christian church continued to exert a strong influence on Britain, and within less than 75 years, Christianity was again the dominant religion. In Scotland and Ireland, never conquered by the Romans, the Celts continued to speak their own language. While the language of the French was heavily influenced by Latin, the Britons spoke, and later wrote, in a language learned and adapted from the Germanic invaders, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. What we think of as modern English is reliant both on its Anglo-Saxon Germanic roots and the influence of Church Latin, as well as the French spoken by the Normans under William the Conqueror, who invaded England from France in 1066. Reading the first text in English rather than in Church Latin is for us an exercise in reading a foreign language that has little resemblance to modern English. According to the British Library website, the opening word of one Old English poem is related to our modern word, what? You'll see that the H and the W are interchanged. That word is translated or meant to stand in place of openings like lo, behold, or hark. The storyteller uses it here to attract the audience's attention. About a third of the words in Beowulf are words known as kennings. Kennings combine two words to create an evocative and imaginative alternative word, such as bone house, meaning human body, or battle light, meaning sword. And of course, with language like that, the words themselves create the poetry. We'll only read a handful of examples of literature from this period. The first is Caedmon's Hymn. Caedmon's Hymn is a brief excerpt from an ecclesiastical history of England by the Venerable Bede. Bede was a monk who spent his life from age 7 in monasteries in his native district of Northumbria. Northumbria lies between the southern kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons and Pictland, which now we know as Scotland. In this work, Bede focuses on the Anglo-Saxon conquest and the kingdoms that comprised England following the withdrawal of the Roman legions. However, Bede's primary theme is the spread of Christianity and the spread of the English church. His, the text tells us, was a moral work and a hagiography of the saints and miracles that testified to the grace and glory of God. If you want to see the difference, you can look at some renderings of the beginning of the Paternoster, or the Lord's Prayer. And you can see that in Old English, we can maybe make out, I don't know. I can't make out much. Can you? When we get to Middle English, we do a little bit better. We can see the hour. Fadir is different, but we can see that that is father. That art, that's pretty clear. The U representing the V is a little different, but if we could make out part of it. Hallowed be the name. So maybe the kingdom come to be the will done in earth as in heaven. Now, my accent stinks. I used to could do better than that. But even though it sounds very strange, we can pick out, once you sort of get used to reading it, you know, you might have to look at the footnotes a lot, but you can still sort of figure out what Chaucer is saying. And of course, we come to the modern English, and then we have the Latin, because of course French, Spanish, and all of these other languages that feed English are also Latinate in their root. They're called the Romance languages from Rome. The Anglo-Saxon world was a mashup of Latin, Celtic, and Germanic language. But it was also a world where a heroic code resembling that of Homer's Greeks rubbed up against a Christianity that had as its heroic center a suffering Christ. Possibly because Latin was the language of the church, the bulk of the literature focuses on religious themes and is drawn from Latin sources. Still, stories cast Moses, St. Andrew, Christ, and God the Father in heroic verse. And this, of course, continues up through the romances that we will read from the Anglo-Norman period. However, this heroic code depended upon the aristocratic, heroic, and kinship values of the Germanic invaders. Allegiances, then, were based upon kinship, not geography. These reliance on kinship ties made for an organization of tribes ruled by a chieftain called a king. Subordinate to the king were lords, who led a band of retainers, warriors or soldiers to be beckoned when needed. Many of these were blood kin and members of the lord's household. The lord, who leads the retainers in battles, is also expected to reward them generously with spoils and take care of his retainers and take care of his people. The heroic code then is based upon an allegiance and a sense of loyalty that goes both ways. You might have noticed that the meaning of the word Lord is literally loaf protector. Isn't that wonderful? The loaf protector. The one who protects the hearth where the family bakes bread and is warmed and sheltered. Of course, ties of kinship often lead to blood feuds. And if you have read some of the Greek tragedies, if this reminds you of Greek tragedy, and much of this seems very similar to Homer's Trojan War, you would be exactly right. So what are some of the characteristics of Anglo-Saxon literature? Well, first is an elegiac tone, a sense of fate, a sense of sorrow. An elegy was a specific kind of Greek poem written in couplets to lament or grieve the end of something, the end of the kingdom, national grief, personal grief. And of course, a lament is very, very similar, although it's not that special kind of poem. And we think of lamenting as crying and weeping, and oftentimes that's what Anglo-Saxon literature seems to draw upon. Poetic diction simply means that the wording and the way the sentences are constructed in poems is different. It's more elevated than in our everyday vernacular diction. Poetry sounds like poetry. It doesn't sound like conversation. One of the most important characteristics is parallelism, using a parallel syntactical structure, which means exactly what it says. We know that parallel means running side by side. We know that syntactic has to do with the structure of the sentences. And a couple of the best examples I can think of are not from poetry, but they bring poetry to life. They sound poetic, even in the one case, though it's prose. You probably studied in history John F. Kennedy's famous statement, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And you see that you have that rising and that falling and that kind of fulcrum in between, which seesaws back and forth with these kind of mirror statements. Another really famous example is, to err is human, to forgive divine. Now, that syntactical parallel structure hinges then on something called a caesura, which is a pause in between. We see this also in Hebrew poetry. The Lord's Prayer, for example, does this sort of same thing. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And you see it often in Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He restoreth my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And it's a kind of call and response pattern as well. And you don't have to have rhyme. You don't have to have a lot of other things going on. It's the rhythm itself that creates the poetry. Formulaic phrases are a hallmark of oral poetry. And of course, many of these poems were passed down before they were written down by these monks in monasteries who created the books. And so the formulaic phrases, I can give you an example right quickly out of Homer, who often says that dawn comes up rosy-fingered. And so, or rosy-fingered dawn. And some people speculate that part of this was because when the bard was trying to think of the next thing, because they had to learn these poems and make them up on the fly, sometimes these formulaic phrases would sort of fall in, and then they sort of became a part of the poetry itself. Special vocabulary, again, that's outside the normal range of diction, would be used. Alliteration has to do with repeating beginning consonants. You probably already learned that along the way somewhere. Where is the war horse? Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. And kenning we already talked about before. And so please do not let this little introduction take the place of reading the introduction in the textbook. It's kind of just an overview. And as you read the assignments to prepare for the little quiz and then prepare for the test that comes at the end of it, just see if you can find some examples of how these Anglo-Saxon writers used these special conventions and techniques in crafting their poetry. And if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, please feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you so much.